Weird tales told by a Dubliner. Be Turlock on me. Story number 1. The Lost Entrance to Hell. In the year 1998, I was working in Panaduz, a village in the Swiss Alps. I had a strange dream before I went there, that I was travelling through Europe on a train, and unaccountably it stopped in the middle of nowhere. I looked out an open door of the carriage I was in, and suddenly the train jolted into life and lurched forward, so that I fell out on the ground and was left behind. Half dazed, I walked into the nearest village, which looked just like Panaduz, as I found out later when I settled there. At any rate, I worked there as an editor of documentation for an outfit called Nevada Electronics. This was originally an American company with a branch plant in Switzerland. However, the Swiss branch turned out to be very successful because it was on the cutting edge of robotics at the time. There was talk at Nevada Panaduz of buying an old factory or two in Eastern Europe now that the Iron Curtain had fallen. The idea was to transfer the manufacture of small parts or components there because labour and other costs were much cheaper than in Switzerland. I had been hearing rumours of this search for locations in Eastern Europe, particularly in Romania and Bulgaria. Now, many of our factory staff, local boys from the surrounding Grisons villages, were quietly worried about the whole idea, because it might lead to their jobs being outsourced to faraway countries. Anyway, it didn't concern me, for I was one of the foreigners, mostly Germans they were, who worked at 1 or 2 levels above the factory floor. I was all the more surprised when I was called to a meeting at the office of the CEO, Hans Widmer, and given to understand it had something to do with opportunities in Eastern Europe. There were 3 of us who went to Widmer's office that day, myself and 2 East Germans, Lutz Kaczynski and Martin Koller. Many of the foreigners who had come here were Aussies, as they were called, Ostdeutsche, East Germans, who had migrated to West Germany and even Switzerland in search of work after the fall of the Berlin Wall nearly 10 years before. Lutz was a man in his 40s, who looked like he'd been through a lot. He came from Leipzig. Martin was a young man in his 20s. He told us he came from Chemnitz, which up till recently had been called Karl-Marx-Stadt. No, it hadn't been so long ago. Now there was an air of expectation as we sat around Widmer's desk. As always, when I was in his spacious executive office, I couldn't help looking out the window at the Domleschg Valley and the soaring alpine peaks on either side. The Nevada factory just didn't seem to belong here in this pastoral setting. It was like as if a huge spaceship from another planet had landed in the rural village that was Panaduz and forgotten to take off again. Widmer lost no time in telling us what he wanted of us. We were to go on a tour of inspection of disused factory sites that had been identified in Bulgaria and Romania. The 2 East Germans, who of course spoke Russian from their school days, were to liaise with the local reception committees, and I was to document our findings in the English language, which was surprising. But I assumed the Americans at head office across the Atlantic would want to be informed and give their approval to whatever site was chosen. I accepted the opportunity to go on a trip to Eastern Europe, especially when I saw that the other 2 were eager, because they'd be able to get along in Russian, of which I knew naught. I assumed that what would be involved would be to tour part of Bulgaria and Romania, look over a few sites, meet the locals, gather information from them, and recommend which of the sites on offer would be the most suitable for what Nevada had in mind. Oddly enough, Vidmar was unable to give us a precise itinerary. He said it still had to be finalised with input from the American side. He promised that he'd give us full instructions by email in the course of our journey, which would take several days. On this inconclusive note, the meeting broke up. We set off less than a week later, on a spring morning, boarding the express train that passed through the village on its way to Vienna and Budapest. We had been issued with laptop computers and cell phones, which were comparatively new gadgets, to me anyway. Also in our luggage, we had been issued sleeping bags, just in case we had to make an overnight stay at some remote site, as it was explained to us. As we boarded the train, I couldn't help thinking of my original dream about Panadoots long before I went there. This time I was boarding the train again, to travel onwards, as had been my previous goal, in the dream that is. After Budapest, we would travel on an onward connection further east to Sofia and Bucharest. My two companions and myself were looking forward to the trip. We talked about the challenges ahead of us, but none of us knew really what to expect. We were waiting for news and instructions from Vidmar. Lutz told stories about his youth. It seems he and a friend went off on a motorcycle to tour the Soviet Union. He only remembered how wonderful the Russians had been, how generous and open-hearted. And then he added, "They are a great people, but they never knew freedom." The instructions finally reached us when we were able to hook up to an internet connection in Budapest. Martin Collar was just able to copy the email and print it out before we left Budapest on the next stage of our journey. It took a while to sink in, but when we grasped the import of it, we were dumbfounded. It turned out that we were only going to look at one site in Bulgaria. That was it. So no stop in Bucharest. It was on to Sofia, and then out into some god-forsaken part of the remote Bulgarian countryside. "Well, the trip will not be so long," said the two others, but we all felt confused by this change of plans. Having arrived in Sofia, we were taken out to the site we were to look at by a government official from the region. We drove to a rather desolate, barely inhabited countryside, as it seemed to me. The official took us through the gate to the main entrance and left us there to do our inspection. When we got into the site, we were dumbfounded again. It was, we had now been told by our local contact, not actually a factory, but an abandoned mine. It existed before the war, and it had been of interest to the Nazis during the war years, when Bulgaria had belonged to the Axis. They had worked on the site for whatever reason. The Soviets had been using it from the 1950s to the 1980s, but it had been disused since then. Sure enough, when we went inside, it was a ruin. There was empty shop floor space, and then we found a stairway down into the mine itself. We walked through the abandoned galleries, feeling disorientated. We studied the information sheets we had been given by our local contact, and the picture began to emerge that this place had to do with atomic power. Maybe they'd been mining for uranium.
I think the Soviets did in fact mine for uranium in Bulgaria after the war,
said Lutz uneasily.
In that case, we will have to proceed with caution, because this place might be contaminated.
Martin and myself groaned at this. It was not what we had been expecting. We hadn't been warned of any risks we might be running here.
Then again, said Lutz thoughtfully, if it was used in the 1930s, the Nazis might have been using the place to make heavy water, which was all they knew then, before there was true atomic fission.
I myself was impressed by the dark mystery that seemed to attach to the place. Maybe they were experimenting on man himself, I said, trying to develop his intellect in new ways that would result in scientific breakthroughs. A research centre. Maybe it was all about intellect. Maybe the Nazis were trying to develop an Aryan Superman. Each one of us took a section of the mine and wandered about, armed with electric torches and in constant touch with cell phone, fearing to be lost in the labyrinth. We felt distinctly uneasy. Finally, Martin chanced upon something of interest. He called us.
I found something. I'm not sure what it is. It looks like a well. Come and look.
Soon the three of us gathered round at the edge of it. It was a well, all right. It was deep, but down there we could see murky liquid. We got a bucket, tied it to the end of a rope, and lowered it down the well, while one of us kept a torch pointed on it all the time, so we could see what happened. The bucket hit the surface, but there seemed to be resistance. It slowly sank beneath the surface, and when we pulled it up again, the contents seemed to have the consistency of mud. It was not quite mud, though.
It was heavy water, all right,
said Lutz, who was apparently in the know about this. We looked down at the bucket slowly going back into the sludge. I blurted, "Intellect must be down there somewhere." "Where?" "In all the heavy water, or down there at a lower level," I said helplessly, not knowing what I was saying. There must be more to this mine, we reasoned. The presence of the well suggested that there might be another level below. But where were the shafts leading down to the rock face, or the bedrock, or wherever it was that they were extracting the uranium? Finally we found a gloomy vertical stairwell and wooden stairs going down. We went down together and were surprised to find not a mining operation at all, but offices and what looked like prison cells. There was a labyrinth of these instead of the expected mine shafts. We looked indoors. There were burns on walls and floors in many places, as if small fires had been started there. As we walked around through the deserted shafts, we heard ghostly shouts and screams, but encountered no one. "There's someone here," said Martin. After a while the cries were coming from various corridors, but faintly. "Whoever it is, they need help," insisted Martin. We opened some of the cell doors that we had been hearing the cries from, but they were all empty, without exception. We were bewildered, and after a while we gave up. "There's no one here," said Lutz. "Then what are we hearing?" There was a silence. "God knows," I said. We had come here for several days, and the local official had shown us a building above ground, which had been used as a dormitory. We set up the sleeping bags we had brought there, and made ourselves as comfortable as we could. Meanwhile, the local guide had been and left us a crate load of provisions and a Primus stove, so we were able to cook for ourselves to some extent. We turned in for the night. There was a terrible oppressive silence in all the countryside around. We all slept a profound dreamless sleep. The next day we continued our exploration of the mine. This time we fanned out among the labyrinthine corridors of the abandoned prison, as it seemed to be. When we reconverged after an hour or so, we had something new to report. We now seemed to see shadowy people down there. Were they ghosts? My companion shrugged. In the afternoon, Lutz found another gloomy stairwell leading down somewhere, so we were able to go down a level further. Here again we found no mine, no evidence of workings of uranium or anything else of that kind. Here it looked more like an educational institution, a school, with offices and classrooms. Again it was completely deserted. Again there were burns along the floors and walls. And again, after a while, we heard the ghostly shouts and screams. We just ignored them now. What were we to do? The whole mine, whatever it was, seemed to be peopled with ghosts. Exploring this level, we found the same kinds of things. Empty rooms that seemed like classrooms, empty corridors. We fanned out again and explored the place, fruitlessly. Eventually Martin let us know by cell phone.
I found something interesting. It's a passage of some sort going down to a lower level. But it's not stairs, it's stone steps.
We all converged on the point he directed us to. When we looked down, it was no longer a stairwell, but a passage seemingly hewn out of rock, spiralling downwards, which was provided with roughly made stone stairs. After some hesitation among us, Lutz said,
"We've got to keep going. Maybe down here we will at last find the secret of the place. What we are looking for."
So we went slowly down the stairs of the passage below, relying on our electric torches to guide us. At a certain point in the descent, we felt a blast of heat coming from below. "There's something going on down here," whispered Martin. "Are they still mining? And if that's what it is, who is mining?" I added slowly. All three of us looked at each other meaningfully. Then Lutz shrugged his shoulders. "The sooner we get to the bottom, the sooner we'll find out." After another 10 minutes or so, we did reach the bottom. This looked like real mine shafts. The air was very hot. There seemed to be a main horizontal shaft, with small shafts branching off it. We walked along the main shaft and looked down into the other shafts. It was another whole floor or level, and suddenly we could see fire burning everywhere. There seemed to be a lake of fire. In the flames, we could make out the figures of people, with their bodies burning, and again shouts and screams were to be heard. The heat was unbearable. Just as we were about to turn back in complete bewilderment, something else happened. We saw a huge figure coming towards us along the main corridor. He must have been about 7 feet tall. He was all ablaze. Through the flames we glimpsed his face, which seemed contorted with rage, or was it pain, or both? His piercing gaze through the flames that engulfed him was riveted on us. It was like the gaze of a lion catching sight of his prey. We didn't pause for reflection. Instinctively, we all turned tail and fled back along the shaft whence we had come. The blazing figure shouted after us in a loud voice that filled the whole cavern.
"Wer seid ihr? Was wollt ihr?"
Getting no reply, he pursued us. We could hear him saying,
"Seid ihr Parteigenossen? Oder wer seid ihr, verdammt nochmal? Ihr sollt euch ausweisen, wenn ihr hier nach unten kommt."
Pursued by the flaming man, we ran along the corridor till we reached the vertical shaft. Without pausing for breath, we clambered up the stone steps again and put some distance between us and our pursuer. When I looked back over my shoulder and over the heads of my two companions, I could see him, framed in the entrance to the shaft down below, his head craned forward, his eyes blazing, his body aflame.
"Seid ihr Schüler? Wollt ihr etwas von uns lernen?"
was the last we heard from him. Needless to say, we hardly paused for breath till we were back up at the level of the classrooms. We could still hear the man shouting faintly from far below, his voice echoing around the rough-hewn walls of the vertical shaft.
"Seid ihr Schüler? Wollt ihr etwas von uns lernen? Ihr sollt euch melden."
We sat exhausted on some chairs in the classroom. I spoke to the fears of my companions. "He won't come up this far. He stays down there. That's his level." Not eager to stay here even, we climbed the wooden stairs to the prison level. All was quiet up there. We heard no cries or screams, and saw no shadowy figures moving about. No doubt we were deafened and overwhelmed by the unspeakable sights we'd seen far below. Once we had gathered our strength, however, we continued on up to ground level. Only then were we content and sat together in the entranceway in the late afternoon sun. For a long time no one spoke. Then Martin, the youngest, asked, shaking his head helplessly, "What have we seen here? What kind of a place is this? And who is responsible for it?" Lutz's voice was low but decisive.
"It is an entrance to hell."
We stared at him. He looked around at us, half smiled ruefully, and began to tell what he knew.
"I think I have heard about this place once before. It was in East Germany. Martin, you would not remember anything like this. You are too young. But it was part of the folklore of socialism, if you like. The idea was that people said that somewhere in Eastern Europe during the war they discovered an entrance to hell. It happened accidentally because they were mining, and because of what they were mining for. To what purpose? No one could ever say where this place was. It strikes me that Bulgaria is as likely a place as any. Before and during the war, the Bulgarians were part of the Axis. The Nazis came here on secret missions to make heavy water and to mine deposits of uranium. It was all part of Heisenberg's project to create an atom bomb for Hitler. After the war, when the Soviets had overrun Bulgaria and installed a communist regime, they reopened the disused mine and continued on where the Nazis had left off, making heavy water, mining uranium. Soon enough, of course, they knew the secret of the atom bomb. In fact, it was no secret any longer.
"But that doesn't explain about what we saw at the bottom," blurted Martin.
"When I was young, I didn't take the folklore seriously," said Lutz. "Now that I have been here and seen for myself, I know the story was true after all. You see, according to the story, the Nazis mined so deep into the earth, in 1938, they found an entrance to hell and raised the devil. He taught them all sorts of secrets, how to make hell above ground. He gave them the idea for Auschwitz and for all the other hells they created in their time. He told them how whole peoples could be exterminated one at a time. The Nazis had little time, but even as they retreated from Eastern Europe, they put what they had learned into practice. When the Soviets took over the mine and explored all the secret shafts, they eventually met the devil too. They could not call him that because if you have the devil, you also have God. So they called him number 666. Or maybe he told them that was his name. He taught them the same secrets he had taught the Nazis, and gave them the idea for the Gulag archipelago. The KGB realized they were onto something here, so they built an underground prison where they transferred intractable political prisoners. Number 666 showed them how to make these men like the souls of the damned, without hope, without relief, without even the grace of oblivion. Soon the KGB had overcome their fear of him. It was said he marched with the KGB men through the prison, going into the cells and the interrogation rooms and leaving traces of burns wherever he went. They went on to build a teaching facility on a level below. Here all KGB men concerned with domestic control and repression in the Soviet Union and in the satellite states were sent. Here they were to learn how to make life above ground a hell for those they called enemies of the people. Number 666 and some of his minions taught courses to these groups of KGB. What is more, they were allowed a glimpse of hell. He paused and looked at the ground, like we were just now.
Go on, I said. How does the story end?
Well, there is really no end. I heard about this place as a young man, and it was said to be still operational, and would be till the end of time. But that was long before the fall of the wall and so on. We know that Gorbachev let the regime in Bulgaria collapse. It was then that the KGB withdrew from the mine here. Since then, I suppose it must have been derelict.
For God's sake, it must be left alone, said Martin, breaking in. It should be closed down permanently, and a perimeter set around it where no one can enter. Ever.
I suppose. We have no business here at any rate,
said Lutz, and Martin and myself nodded.
And yet,
Lutz went on,
number 666 is down there, and he is just waiting for another opportunity. The Soviets, some of them anyway, know about this place.
But there is no more Soviet Union, objected Martin, and Bulgaria is free.
You did not know the communist regime for more than a few years while you were growing up, Martin, said Lutz, and added with a grin, in Karl Marxstadt. Yet we had the regime for 40 years in Germany, and the Soviet Union lasted for 70 years. Do you really think all that is gone for good? No, I tell you. A new Stalin will arise, and he will reconstitute the regime in Moscow and march back through Europe, adding countries to his empire. The mine will live again, and number 666 will be back, teaching men how to make hell on earth.
No, Martin said, shaking his head vigorously. The Russians will not stand for it. The Russian people, I mean.
Listen to me, said Lutz. When I was younger than you, I and a friend from the Polytechnic decided to travel to Russia on a motorcycle and tour the country. We were allowed to do that. It was good for socialist solidarity between our brother nations. So we went to Russia, and you know what I'm going to tell you? We had the time of our lives. We saw the greatness of Russia, how big it was, but also the greatness of the people's hearts. I have never met such a generous, open, hospitable people as the Russians. I've told you that. So I do not see them as the enemy or anything like that. But the Russians, great people though they are, lived for many centuries without freedom. Under the Romanovs, they knew serfdom, the knout, and exile in Siberia. Under Lenin and Stalin, it was more of the same. The Russians really know no other reality. They can live with no other reality. What makes them great is their endless capacity for suffering. And who is to say they are wrong? Who is to say that what we have now will last, that it is not just an interlude? He looked around at us. Let me tell you about the Russians, he said. To express their greatness, they need to suffer. They need some czar or dictator to make life a hell for them. Only then are they driven to create, to invent, to sing, to play, to dance. They cannot be great without the suffering. It is the fire that consumes them, but the fire that makes them a light to the world. Think just of the world of music. Think of what Shostakovich went through. Think that Prokofiev voluntarily went back there. It was the suffering, the resistance to implacable tyranny, the survival under endless tyranny that made the Russians great creatively. Not because of tyranny, but in spite of it. Once the tyranny was gone, they became listless and rudderless. You see that now. At the moment they seem like drunkards ruled by a drunkard. But it cannot last. A new Stalin will arise, with the old Soviet belligerents returning, and becoming a national ideology. The Red Army will again be on the march westwards. These new Soviets will surely be back to mine the secrets of the underworld. And the place is here. Number 666 is waiting, though not for us.
He broke off with a shudder and said no more. We spent one further night in the dormitory. We called our local contact and told him to come and pick us up at the entrance to the mine on the following morning. We left the place as we'd found it, never to return. We travelled back to Panaduts and reported to Vidmar. I wrote my written report, in which I described as best I could the 3 levels of the mine and the encounter with number 666. I expected no one to believe me. When I asked him, Vidmar said he had not read the report. I only read 1-page summaries, he said with a wave of his hand. But he'd sent it on to headquarters in America. No doubt this was really a NATO spying mission we had been on. No action was taken as far as I know. And certainly Novada Electronics did not buy the abandoned mine. They bought a factory somewhere in Romania, ran it for a few years until it became more profitable to make the spare parts in a new facility they built in the village next to Panaduts, using Swiss workers. The Romanians took over the factory themselves and did something else with it. Now that Russia has become the Soviet Union again in all but name, perhaps the Russians are back at the old mine again, going down there and learning to build hell on earth. There is an inevitability about the whole thing. Once an entrance to hell opens, they say, it cannot be closed. It can only be ignored or explored. All progress on earth depends on some hero grasping the torch he's given, going down to the underworld, learning its lessons and bringing them back. Once he conversed with spirits and with dark gods. Now it is the flaming man who waits patiently in his caverns below. He has much to teach his visitors. He stands ready to shape once more the future of mankind. You have been listening to The Lost Entrance to Hell by Turlough Conmee from Weird Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.